treaties were, in her view, in her research, this is why treaties were started. So this act was saying that they were going to stop actually negotiating any treaties, and that we had no more rights to the land over which we roam, and that we should go upon reservations to be protected and taught the arts of civilized life, and that we were to have no alternative but to choose between this policy of the government and extermination. So there's genocide right in the documents of the U.S. Congress. Indians shall be placed on reservations to be wards of the government, controlled and managed at its discretion. And then in terms of the boarding school, that was another part of the plan and a part of the genocide. And it wasn't just the forced assimilation. And looking at some of the social policy literature from the past, it was also an effort to break the collective landholding and the values of the people. So if they could do that with the children, then the government could get at the land. That was part of the idea behind the boarding schools. So the BIA Education Division used to be called the Civilization Division, and probably a number of you know that the Department of the Interior was under the BIA was under the War Department, and gender roles and relationships were actually impaired by the boarding schools because at the time of the colonization of this country, women and children were the property of men in England. And that's the attitude, that's the values that were brought over here. So it was male and female definitions that were not our own, but that were imposed on us. And when you see the slides at the end, you'll see some examples of kids in boarding school where you can really see the gender differences are kind of really brought out in the slides that are the European gender ideas at that time. And tuberculosis was also connected with the overcrowded conditions in the boarding schools. And there was a bill that was passed in Congress for the establishment of boarding schools, because initially it was an experiment. And there's a lot of history around that, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But the bill talked about using vacant military posts and barracks and employment of officers of the Army as teachers and to be detailed by the Secretary of War. So again, there's this sort of hostile legacy that, you know, in the referral to us as savage and to remove the children from all tribal influence. So that's basically, in a nutshell, what we start with in the intervention, is going through the history and you know, we pace it and we have time for people to respond and process. Now these are, in terms of understanding the trauma, we talk about some of the historical trauma response features. And this is very similar to the Jewish Holocaust Childhood Survivors complex. It includes things like survivor guilt, because we survived, but many of our ancestors and relatives did not, and we have some guilt about that sometimes. And so what we do is unconsciously set ourselves up to suffer. So we're suffering with our people. And so you'll see things like kids dropping out of school, or somebody getting close to graduation and then they don't finish, things like that, where we unconsciously do that. It's also related to this loyalty to our ancestors and identification with the ancestors. And the same thing Dr. Fogelman writes about, and she says that because the children of Holocaust survivors are loyal to their deceased ancestors or relatives, then they identify with the suffering, then they unconsciously act out the suffering in their own lives in order to remain loyal. So when I heard that from her, I thought that was very similar from what I've seen a lot in our communities. So you sometimes have post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, depression, the psychic numbing, fixation to trauma, which we know is not only emotional fixation or attachment to trauma, but it's also psychobiological. Now there's enough literature on how trauma affects the brain chemistry and it's almost like having, putting on glasses that you look through with the trauma lens, so everything you see is potentially traumatic, and it keeps all those stress hormones elevated, and which is very damaging to your body and your brain and your short-term memory. The good news is that with healing and therapy, that things can shift. So we also have a lot of physical symptoms or somatic symptoms. That's another word for physical. Low self-esteem, victim identity, like walking around with a scarlet V on your head or on your, those t-shirts with the, what are they, bullseyes on you, and it's kind of like that. Anger, self-destructive behavior, because there's this thing that I think for me is like, sometimes I feel like I've cheated death, because knowing that we're genocide survivors and that we were never supposed to survive, the plan was to just, eliminate us, then you kind of feel like you're not really supposed to even be alive. So I think sometimes we internalize that. It's not that conscious, but we internalize that, and then we feel like we're not supposed to be here. And another thing that I want to point out, well, two more, is the hypervigilance, which is waiting for the other shoe to drop, staying on guard, expecting something else to happen. And hypervigilance is actually talked about in adult children of alcoholics meetings. So a good example is a kid coming home to an alcoholic home and trying to figure out, is it going to be safe? Is mom going to be drinking? Is dad going to be there? Is mom going to be fighting with dad? Or, and sort of rapid thoughts, and the heart rate starts going up, and trying to figure out, how am I going to keep myself safe? So when you're chronically traumatized, you're preoccupied anywhere you go with being safe and keeping yourself safe. Another good example of hypervigilance is if you've ever been in a car accident, then you find yourself, you have this automatic startle response if a car comes from the same direction of the car that hit you. You just automatically jump, even though there's no danger. So that's because it's sort of encoded in your brain. And the compensatory fantasies basically means to compensate, means to kind of to make up for. So what was observed in children Holocaust survivors was that they tried to make up for the Holocaust with their parents. And I feel like our people have a lot of that too. We try to make up for the trauma of the collective trauma of our people and our ancestors. And that's a tremendous amount of pressure to live under, because we can't do that. We didn't cause it, and we can't do that. So a lot of us are struggling in our lives because we feel so responsible to try to fix or to undo this painful past. This sort of relates to that, vitality is the last one on the, let's see, it's on your right. Vitality in one's own life is seen as a betrayal to ancestors who've suffered so much. That's that loyalty to the deceased and kind of internalizing or taking in all of the suffering. I'm going to go through this quickly, but just that those stress hormones like cortisol are implicated in type 2 diabetes. So it's not all about diet and exercise. It's about trauma. That's a big part of it. So that because these changes in our bodies with the stress hormones interfere with the body's use of insulin. So that's why some people, I'm not a physician, but that's why some people may be thin and doing the diet and exercise, and they still have high rates of their blood sugar is still elevated. And there's more complex reasons too, but there's actually a physician in Cherokee, North Carolina, Dr. Ann Bullock, who's been looking at that in terms of the role of historical trauma with type 2 diabetes. And there's some other things about our internalizing our self-hatred and its identification with the aggressor. Anna Freud talked about that, which is she was working with children who were abused, and then they identified with the abusive parent, because children are very loyal to their parents, and so they blame themselves because they want the parents to be perfect, so they think it's their fault, and so they kind of turn against themselves. Or Paulo Freire's concept of internalized oppression. He was a Brazilian sociologist, and where people who are oppressed have all these feelings about it, but it's dangerous to direct those feelings at the oppressor because of the oppression. And so these feelings have to go somewhere. And so what we tend to do is internalize and hate ourselves and hate others like us. So this explains a lot of the, what people call lateral violence, crabs in the bucket thing in our community. Because it's that we sort of project out the self-hatred and then we hate others like us. So, and it's possible to not do that, but you just have to really, that's when hypervigilance can be good, you know, a good thing in a sense that, I mean, in terms of being alert to watching that internalized depression in yourself. So, releasing our pain is another part of our intervention, and I'll skip this because I do talk about that, the video. So, and some of the intervention work, what we've seen is evaluating our work, and this is kind of a summary of what we've seen before and after. Reduction in shame, stigma, anger, sadness, guilt, reduction in that compensatory fantasy thing, that sense of feeling responsible to undo the pain of the past, an increase in joy and hope, and an improved sense of self and of one's tribe. And in terms of transcending the trauma, it's transcending really means to move beyond, move through it and to move beyond. And there are things that we can continue to do, and that's talked a little bit about in the video. So I'm going to skip some of this. This is just about the first historical trauma intervention that we did, and I already explained that. So I left these up in case people were interested. One thing that I did want to point out was the last one in terms of joy, because I thought that was really interesting that the women were more joyful in the beginning than the men. So if you look at the first column at the bottom, the women were almost 59% reported feeling joyful, but the men were 33%. And then you look at the last column after the intervention, the women's joy increased up to 70%, almost 71%. But look how much the men went up to almost 87%. And I think that for us, this was with a Lakota group, I think for us, by going through the history, the men realized that who are the warriors and protectors traditionally, they realized that they were powerless to do anything to protect the women and children that were massacred at Wounded Knee. And men were massacred too, but it was a lot of women and children, and the men had already been disarmed. But I think it lifted something for them, that they weren't responsible for this, and I felt like they were internalizing it. It also is possible that women and men may process grief differently. They may have come in different stages of grief. And there were also more full-blood men in the group than women. And the men reported higher trauma exposure from sexual abuse in boarding school, which was interesting to see. So more work needs to be done. It was too small of a group to really do more sophisticated analysis with that. But to see if, you know, the full-blood men and full-blood women are more exposed to trauma, discrimination, racism, but some of our reports too was that the mixed blood men and women and lighter-skinned Native people didn't escape trauma, because some of them got treated pretty badly in boarding school too, because some of the white matrons resented them, that they were as white looking as the matron, but yet they were Indian, so they couldn't deal with that. But it's interesting to look at that. So everybody got some kind of traumatic experience in that kind of situation. And then from our work with parents, they felt more competent as parents or more skilled as parents after the intervention. They started speaking the traditional language more, which we weren't even trying to aim for, but that's just something that happened, which is a really good thing. And then increased communication with parents, grandparents, their children, their extended family kinship network, and increased pride in their tribe and in traditional values. I want to mention this and maybe one or two other things, and then we'll go into